Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode of my history series, where today we're going to be delving into another bit of lesser known history, something which should probably be common knowledge but simply isn't. I'm going to be sharing the story of Claudette Colvin with you, how she refused to give up her seat on the bus many months before Rosa Parks did the same, and how Claudette's story inspired the story of Rosa. Without Claudette, we probably wouldn't know the name Rosa Parks, but she's often forgotten in the narrative. So today we're going to try and fix that a little bit. Their stories are intrinsically linked forever. Of course, this video is sponsored by Magellan TV, the documentary streaming service. If you're a loyal viewer of my channel, then you'll already know why I love Magellan TV. So instead of listing all the reasons why I love it this week, I'm just going to tell you about a documentary I watched and loved. It's a brand new release on the platform called War Zika. One of the nerdiest things about me, and there's a lot of nerdy things about me, but this might be the nerdiest, is my fascination with epidemiology, the study of how often diseases occur and why. So when I saw this in the new releases section on Magellan TV, I jumped at it. You probably remember all the headlines about the Zika virus from a few years ago. It's a mosquito-spread disease which can have serious consequences on fetuses if a pregnant woman is infected, whilst having very little effect on the woman herself. This documentary explores the origins of the disease, how it came to be, the devastating effects it's had, and how it actually spread undetected for many years before becoming an epidemic in South America. This is the story of the race the medical community had to figure out this disease and how to prevent the effects, if they could at all. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed this, and I'm pretty sure you will too. But even if this isn't your thing, there are 15 to 20 hours of new content added weekly, so you'll always find something up your street. If you want to try out Magellan TV for yourself and watch War Zika, then you can click on the link in the description box to claim your 1 month free trial. All the documentaries you can dream of, and I know a lot of you here are true crime fans as well, so I'm pleased to announce that they have more true crime documentaries than you could even dream of. I feel like I need to start this video with a bit about Rosa Parks and her story. I know that the majority of you will already know all about Rosa Parks, but I never want to assume that everyone here has the same knowledge, so we're going to start off there. Rosa Parks is often referred to as the mother of the civil rights movement. She was up there along with Martin Luther King Jr. and E.D. Nixon, but what I don't think a lot of people realise is that to an extent, her position within this part of the movement was entirely orchestrated. Rosa Parks was pushed forward as the face of the Montgomery bus boycott because she fitted the mould of what the civil rights leaders needed. But that's what you're going to learn all about in today's video. Rosa Parks was born February 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama. Yes, that Tuskegee of the again very racist Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I have a video all about that which I'll link if you want to learn more after you've watched this one. She didn't stay in Tuskegee for too long though, as eventually her parents separated and she ended up moving to Pine Level, just outside of the Alabama state capital of Montgomery. There she spent her childhood on a farm with her mother, grandparents and younger brother, and she realised from a very young age that she had a talent for sewing. Rosa grew up around racism, and she said that from a young age she noticed there was a black world and a white world. She attended a segregated school where she eventually had to drop out of to care for sick family, and she would watch as the KKK marched down the street and as her grandfather protected their home with a shotgun. She would hear of lynches happening in the very streets that she walked daily, and she was bullied by the white children in her neighbourhoods. But of course, Rosa Parks was never one to just lay down and accept it. She would always retaliate to the bullying, and that's a mindset that stuck around with her for the rest of her life. Age 19, Rosa married Raymond Parks, who was an active member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, and Raymond was actively fighting to end racial injustice. Raymond encouraged Rosa to finish her education, and so she goes back to school and gets her high school diploma, something that less than 10% of black people had at the time. Over the years, the couple worked together with any social justice organisations, and eventually Rosa was elected secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. And even that was a battle. She faced a lot of misogyny to even get there. All of this to say, by the time Rosa Parks refused to get out of her seat on the bus, she was already an established organiser and leader within the civil rights movement in Alabama. She wasn't a random, obscure woman who was making a stand. She had been fighting the good fight for years. She put in the work. Rosa had worked on numerous cases with the NAACP, but there weren't many successes. Her story has long been seen as a symbol of the civil rights movement. She's an icon of resistance. It was Thursday the 1st of December 1955 in Montgomery when Rosa boarded the Cleveland Avenue bus at around 6 p.m, paying her fare and taking a seat in the first row of seats reserved in the coloured section of the bus. Jim Crow laws were alive and well in Alabama at the time, meaning that there was a strict separation of black and white people. Segregated schools, segregated toilets, water fountains, black and white people were forbidden from marrying each other, they couldn't play on the same sports teams or swim in the same pools, and pretty much anything else you could think of, including public transport. Each state had their own rules and systems in place when it came to segregation, but in Alabama, the bus system looked something like this. The first 4 rows of seats in the buses were reserved for white people, while there was a section at the rear of the bus for black people. Straight away, this is disproportionate, as over 75% of the bus ridership in Montgomery at the time was black. There would be a movable sign that the bus conductor or bus driver could move to their whim, marking where the white section ended and the black section began. If he so wished, the driver could remove the black section altogether. And black people couldn't even walk through the front of the bus to take their seats if there were already white people seated. They couldn't walk past them, meaning that they had to pay for their fare at the front of the bus, disembark, and then walk around to the rear of the bus to board. If you got a particularly nasty driver that day, they could just drive off, leaving you short of money and still on the pavement. Something which happened to Rosa herself on one occasion in 1943. Montgomery would also pretty much only hire burly and intimidating men as their drivers. They were expected to be bouncers of sorts to ensure that the black people stayed in their place at the back of the bus. You wouldn't want to fight back against them, that's for sure. If the white section of the bus got filled, the black section would be pushed backwards to provide more space for the whites. Of course, a white person couldn't be expected to sit next to a black person, so the entire row of black people would be told to get up and move further back. If there were no seats available, they would even have to stand or leave the bus to make more room. Something that I can only imagine was completely dehumanising. Something that's very interesting to know though is that this wasn't an actual law. Ordinance from 1900 said that no rider had to give up a seat, but drivers ignored this law for the most part until eventually it became forgotten that this was a thing at all. It was just expected by everyone for black people to have to move if a white person required a seat. It didn't matter how old, young, sick, healthy, if you were pregnant, you had to give it up. The white person came first. On the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move when the bus driver asked her to make way for a white passenger. Rosa took a figurative stand by sitting and refused to move, whilst the other 3 black people in her row did move backwards. Rosa simply moved towards the window seat. She didn't get up, she didn't move to the rear of the bus, she didn't clear the row. Over the many years since, people have tried to diminish the reason why she did this, saying that she was just a tired seamstress who didn't have the energy to move, but that's not true. Rosa herself has said, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. She would also later say of her motivations that as she sat there, she thought of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy who had been lynched in Mississippi just months beforehand in the August. Emmett was accused of making a sexual comment towards a white woman in a grocery store and was hunted down by her relatives and lynched. Years later, it was revealed that the woman had lied. Emmett hadn't even done anything. Rosa said she thought of Emmett Till, of the pain he suffered and the pain of so many other black people, and she couldn't get up. Soon the bus driver called the police to have her arrested, and it would later transpire that the bus driver, James F. Blake, was the exact same driver who had driven off after Rosa had paid her fare all those years earlier. Before long, the police turned up to arrest her, with Rosa saying, "Two policemen came on the bus and one asked me if the driver had told me to stand. He wanted to know why I didn't stand, and I told him I didn't think I should have to stand up. I asked him, why did they push us around? He said, I don't know, but the law is the law and you are under arrest." Rosa eventually stood up and was escorted off the bus, placed in the back of a police car and driven to police headquarters. She was charged with violating Chapter 6, Section 11 of the segregation law of the Montgomery City Code, although the charge was dubious. The law was to do with black people sitting in white-only seats, but she'd been in the coloured section of the bus at the time. She was bailed out of jail that same evening by the president of the local chapter of the NAACP, Edgar Nixon, but ultimately she only had to pay a $10 fine after being found guilty in a short court hearing. But from there, it was somewhat of a snowball effect. The NAACP were going to fight the charge against Rosa, seize the opportunity they had here to raise some awareness. But the important thing to note here is that Rosa Parks is not the first person to ever take a stand on these buses. She wasn't the first black person to refuse to move when asked. We're going to be focusing on the story of Claudette Colvin for the rest of this video, but even then there are many more brave people who took a seat. Most of the people who did such a thing would just be quietly fined and no one heard much more of them, but Claudette was the first person to properly challenge this law. She didn't stop at just refusing to move. Claudette Colvin was born on the 5th of September 1939 in Birmingham, Alabama, and was originally raised by her great-aunt and great-uncle. Claudette said she was raised by everyone in the town though. She would sleep in her mother's friends' houses as much as her own and learned about the world from everyone around her. But when she was 8 years old, her mother inherited a house in a poor black neighbourhood called King Hill in Montgomery, and excited to have a place to call their own, Claudette, her mother and her sister moved there. Similar to her hometown, King Hill was a tight-knit community where everyone looked out for one another. Claudette was always very aware of segregation in her city. In 1952, she started attending a segregated high school, Booker T. Washington High School, which was one of only 2 public high schools in Montgomery for black students. It was clear that she was a smart kid and excelled in many areas, but she struggled to fit in despite her brains. Her skin was considered too dark to be popular even at a black school. She couldn't make her hair lie flat, and she was from one of the poorest neighbourhoods in the city. And on top of that, when she started school, she'd only lost her sister to polio just 2 weeks beforehand. Claudette was struggling, and she was incredibly sensitive to her struggles and the struggles of other people. I used the book Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Justice by Philip Hoose a lot in my research for this video, and he extensively interviewed Claudette whilst he was writing it. She shared many of her experiences in Montgomery with him, including how even something as simple as shopping was something which came with so many roadblocks thanks to racism. She said that black people could shop in white stores because of course they'd be happy to take her money, but they weren't allowed to try anything on. She wasn't even allowed in the fitting room. Claudette said the sales ladies would measure you and then bring the clothes out, expecting you to buy them without trying anything on. When Claudette and her sister needed shoes, their mum would have to trace the shapes of their feet onto brown paper bags and take them into the store because they wouldn't be allowed to try the shoes on. If you wanted to try on a hat, to be made to put a stocking over your head first. It was completely degrading. And that's all if the salespeople were even willing to help in the first place. She tells another story of a time she had to go to the optometrist, and Claudette was the first patient to arrive. She was the only one in the waiting room. But she was told to leave and come back at the end of the day, and it was only later when she overheard her parents talking did she realise it's because they had to let all the white people sit in the chair first before a black person. Claudette knew from early on that life was just never going to be fair for her. Another big event that formed who she was to become was the arrest of her school friend and neighbour, 16-year-old Jeremiah Reeves. He was arrested for raping a white woman and he quickly confessed to the crime. But then soon police were charging him with the rapes of 6 different white women after breaking into their homes. Jeremiah was somewhat of a rock star at his school and in the neighbourhood. He was one of the cool kids, he was a drummer in the school band, and he always wore these starched clean shirts with spotless shoes. He was really cool, and Claudette considered him a friend. As I said, Jeremiah did originally confess to this crime, but it's widely thought that the police threatened him into the confession, with Martin Luther King Jr. later writing, "One of the authorities had led him to the death chamber, threatening that if he did not confess at once, he would burn there later." Jeremiah claimed that he was forced to sit in the electric chair for a whole night until he confessed to the crime. He was scared into it. The confession, of course, didn't help him though, as after a short trial and a jury of all white men, of course, Jeremiah was found guilty and was sentenced to death via the electric chair. He denied ever having sex with the white woman in question and went through the process of appeal, but it all just fell on deaf ears. In 1954, the US Supreme Court did throw out his conviction and they ordered a brand new trial, but in a shock to no one, another all-white jury convicted him once again and reinstated the death penalty. That decision took them only 34 minutes. Jeremiah was held in prison on death row for many years as he was a minor, and the minimum age for execution was 21. He died on March 28, 1958, in the very same chair that had been used to scare him into a confession all those years earlier. It's said that Jeremiah's story radicalised a lot of students at Booker T. Washington High School, Claudette included. It was kind of a case of things like that always happen to other people. You hear stories, but it doesn't happen that close to home, until it does. As Philip Hoos writes in his book, Jeremiah's plight pulled Claudette's attention away from her personal difficulties to the injustices blacks faced everywhere. She went to rallies, wrote letters to him in prison, and collected money for his legal defence. The effort to support Jeremiah Reeves became the first time many black teenagers in Montgomery ever acted to address injustices outside their own personal problems. Claudette Colvin was one of those teens. Claudette would say that Jeremiah's arrest was the turning point in her life. She was furious because of the hypocrisy of it all. She had been warned from a young age to never let herself be alone with a white man. She had multiple friends who had been raped by white men and not a single one of them had ever been punished. But this innocent black boy was put to death for a rape he didn't even commit. As time went on, Claudette decided that she was going to be just like her idol, Harriet Tubman. She was going to make a change. When Brown versus the Board of Education outlawed segregation in public schools, a lot of Claudette's classmates were furious. Why would they want to sit next to a white student who's probably just going to be racist? But Claudette was one of the few who welcomed it. If white students started attending her school, then maybe they would all get the equivalent of a white education, which was a lot more advanced. It was Wednesday the 2nd of March 1955 when Claudette would finally have her chance to make a difference. School had finished early that day because of a faculty meeting, and so her and her friends caught the bus home together as they always did. There were no white people on the bus when they first got on, and the girls made their way to their section about halfway down the bus. Claudette sat next to the window, balancing her textbooks on her lap. But as the journey progressed, more and more white people boarded until all the white section was filled to the point where people had to stand. Claudette noticed a white woman standing next to the row that she was sat in, looking at her and her friends expectantly, just waiting for them to vacate the row. The driver also noticed this in his mirror and shouted back, "I need those seats." As Claudette later said, she might have considered getting up if the woman was elderly, but she wasn't. She was just about 40 years old. Whilst her friends moved without a fuss, Claudette said that she just couldn't. She couldn't stand up. The woman could have just sat in the now vacated seats on the other side of the row where Claudette's friends had been sat, but she wouldn't, because this was symbolic. White people couldn't be seen as equal with black. She couldn't sit on the same row as Claudette. Claudette had to be behind her. The driver soon noticed that Claudette hadn't moved and shouted again, "Why are you still sitting there?" And then another white rider yelled, "You've got to get up." In response, a black classmate called Margaret Johnson shouted from the back of the bus, "She ain't got to do nothing but stay black and die." Claudette remained in her seat. She knew there was a rule that they couldn't make you get up if there was no other seat available for you, even if a white person was left without. But, you know, the rules didn't really matter. At the next stop, the driver summoned the transit police to come inside and talk to Claudette. At the same time, a heavily pregnant neighbour of Claudette's called Mrs. Hamilton came and sat down next to her, unaware of all the commotion. So when the police officers arrived, they found two black women sitting in the seats. He ordered the women to get up, to which Mrs. Hamilton replied she didn't feel like it. Claudette also didn't. The officer was hesitant to manhandle the very pregnant Mrs. Hamilton, so he tells a group of black men seated towards the back that they had to give the lady a seat, to which they scrambled to make space. So Mrs. Hamilton makes her way back there, leaving Claudette. Claudette continues to refuse to get up, but the officer is only a transit policeman. He can't actually make arrests. There's not really much he can do. He was just there to intimidate people into submission, I suppose. So the bus has to continue on to the next stop, where two Montgomery City policemen are waiting for them. They asked the driver who the issue was, to which the driver pointed to Claudette, and the officer said, "That's nothing new. I've had trouble with that thing before." Yes, he used the word thing to refer to her. He told her to get up, to which Claudette said, "No, sit." He shouted and she started crying, but she was steadfast in her determination. She said over and over again, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare, it's my constitutional right." Regardless, one officer grabbed one hand and the other grabbed the other, and they pulled Claudette up, making her books on her lap fly everywhere. Too smart to actually fight back, Claudette just went limp as they dragged her off the bus backwards, kicking her as they did so. She didn't touch them, she didn't swear, she just shouted out her rights repeatedly. They put her in the back of the police car before deciding that they then needed to handcuff her, so they made her stick her hands out of the window. One officer climbed in the back with her, and for the entire journey they just ridiculed Claudette, calling her names, making fun of her. She was 15 years old, and they took turns trying to guess her bra size and spoke about her body. Disgustingly, she considered herself lucky that she wasn't raped or beaten by the officers. She said that she just said the Lord's Prayer over and over again in her head. She thought they'd take her to the juvenile court because of her age, that they'd punish her by making her pick cotton, but instead they took her to the adult city jail. She wasn't allowed to make a phone call, so her mum found out what had happened when her friends on the bus ran home and called her at the house where she worked as a maid. Claudette's mum and their pastor rushed straight to the jail, and the pastor bailed her out. Obviously, Claudette was scared. She'd suffered this huge traumatic event, but she said that when she got home to King Hill, she was treated like royalty. Everyone was so proud of her. But there were fears of repercussion. Black people got lynched for much less than this, and so Claudette's father sat up all night with his shotgun, ready for people to turn up. And it said that nobody in the neighbourhood slept that night. They were so scared that somebody was going to come for Claudette. Over the coming days, news of what Claudette had done spread throughout Montgomery, and even further than that, she received letters of encouragement from across the country. She'd started somewhat of a revolution, but there was the real risk that she was about to be convicted and sent to jail. But Claudette was Claudette. It was never going to be an option for her to just plead guilty and go quietly with a fine, as so many people had done before her. Everyone started working together to get Claudette representation, starting with the NAACP and Edgar Nixon. Claudette had been charged with disturbing the peace, violating segregation laws, and battering and assaulting a police officer, the last charge of which was absolutely made up. There was no assault. She never touched a police officer. Black leaders from across the city got together and got to work, and soon the bus company had to concede that Claudette technically hadn't broken any laws. Even the police commissioner agreed that the seating rules were confusing and promised that the city's attorney would clarify them in writing for everyone. But despite this, they didn't drop the charges against Claudette. It was around this point that Edgar Nixon got in contact with Rosa Parks and urged her to talk to Claudette and get her involved in the NAACP herself. The first time the two met was in a church before an NAACP meeting. Rosa came up to Claudette and said, "You're Claudette Colvin? Oh my god, I was looking for some big old burly overgrown teenager who sassed white people out. But no, they pulled a little girl off the bus." Claudette replied, "They pulled me off because I refused to walk off." With the trial coming up fast, Claudette's lawyer was a man called Fred Gray, who was reportedly determined to destroy segregation. He jumped at the chance to represent Claudette. He wanted a chance to prove that segregation laws were unconstitutional. There had never been a chance to do this before, simply because no one else had ever pleaded not guilty to breaking segregation laws in a bus arrest. Claudette was challenging Jim Crow in a way that no one else had ever had the balls to. But of course, the odds were always going to be stacked against her. Just before lunchtime on the day of her trial, Claudette was found guilty on all charges. She was placed on probation, declared a ward of the state, and released to the custody of her parents. Claudette was a criminal and she had done literally nothing wrong. And the black people of Montgomery were getting restless. Rebellion was in the air and talk of boycotting the bus system entirely were circulating. With over 75% of the clientele of the Montgomery city buses, if black people stopped getting on the bus, the company would be, for lack of a better word, screwed. People had their concerns about boycott though. Some were concerned that Claudette was too young to be the trigger for such a huge thing, that she might not be able to handle the pressure. Plus, Claudette was clearly a rebellious teen, which is great to begin something like this, but would they be able to control her and pull her back when they needed to? On top of all of this, Claudette was dark-skinned and she came from a lower-class family. She didn't fit the mould of what they needed. They needed someone that perhaps even the white community could sympathise with, perhaps someone lighter-skinned and higher class. Yeah, colorism was a real issue even within the black community. So the NAACP actually pulled back from Claudette Colvin. They knew they had one chance at a bus boycott and it had to work. The trigger person for such a thing had to be somebody they could win with. But whilst the NAACP didn't protest Claudette's conviction with a bus boycott, they did make an effort to raise money to appeal her ruling, partly to clear her name and partly so they could keep using her case to fight segregation laws, which they were going to appeal all the way up to federal court. She wasn't forgotten, she just wasn't the face that they needed. Not that that was going to stop Claudette from making her statement though. After this whole ordeal, she decided to make a statement another way. She was going to make people listen. She just stopped having her hair straightened. Why should she have to conform to a white society's idea of beauty? Claudette simply put her hair in cornrows and went off to school, something that just simply wasn't done. No one could understand why she did it. She wasn't allowed to be in the school play because of it. Classmates would whisper about her as she walked down the hallways. But Claudette was proud of her hair and her heritage. She described herself as African when nobody else did. This was not a girl who was about to go down without a fight. She attended the NAACP's weekly youth meetings along with her mentor, Rosa Parks. Her legal battle did eventually die off, but Claudette truly had sparked something incredibly important. Fast forward a few months and the black leaders in Montgomery were still looking for the right person or right event to spark a revolution. And this is what you've got to understand about the Rosa Parks story. What happened in the aftermath was carefully orchestrated. Does that make it any less important? Not at all. But this was months of hard work, careful planning to make sure that everything came together at the exact right moment. So when Rosa Parks, of her own accord, refused to move from her seat on the bus on December 2nd, 1955, and subsequently got arrested, the leaders sprung into action. They distributed leaflets to tens of thousands of black Montgomery residents, urging them to stay off the buses the coming Monday in protest of the arrest and trial of Rosa Parks. And hers was a name that a lot of these black residents would have already known. She was a well-known member of the community. When Rosa left the courthouse after her hearing, she left with several hundred supporters cheering her on. The leaflet read, "Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. You can afford to stay out of school for one day if you have no other way to go except by bus. You can also afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children and grown-ups, don't ride the bus at all on Monday. Please stay off the buses on Monday." Claudette had lit a fuse and the explosion happened with Rosa. Rosa Parks was well respected, everyone knew her, she was pleasant and level-headed. Martin Luther King Jr. said of Rosa, "Mrs. Parks was ideal for the role assigned to her by history. Her character was impeccable and her dedication deep-rooted. She was the perfect face for a revolution." Claudette and her efforts by this point were a thing of the past, and now she'd fallen pregnant. She was a teenage mother. The shame of this caused Claudette to fall into the shadow, and her school had a rule of pregnancy means expulsion. So when they discovered she was pregnant, they told her not to come back. The family decided to send her to Birmingham for her to have the baby in secret and finish her schooling there, but not long before she left, a neighbour came over with a leaflet about the bus boycott. Claudette saw her name on the leaflet written as Claudette Colvin, and I can only imagine in that moment she knew she'd been forgotten. She said to Philip Hoose for the book, "When I heard on the news that it was Rosa Parks, I had several feelings. I was glad an adult had finally stood up to the system, but I felt left out. I was thinking, hey, I did that months ago and everybody dropped me. There was a time when I thought I would be the centrepiece of the bus case. I was eager to keep going in court. I had wanted them to keep appealing my case. I had enough self-confidence to keep going. But it simply wasn't to be." She said that everyone turned their backs on her, especially after she got pregnant. The following Monday, December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott took place. Black taxi drivers across the city offered 10-cent rides, the fare equal to that of the bus. Approximately 40,000 black bus riders boycotted the system. That same afternoon, leaders met to form the Montgomery Improvement Association. They needed a group different from the NAACP purely to focus on the boycott. And Martin Luther King Jr. was elected president. He was actually elected president because he hadn't been in the city very long at this point. He hadn't yet had the opportunity to make strong enemies or strong friends. He was fairly neutral. It was decided that day that the boycott would continue until the city met their demands, which they officially issued on December 8th. Interestingly, this at first didn't include changing segregation laws. They just requested courtesy, the hiring of black drivers, and a first-come, first-served seating policy. I can only assume that they didn't want to make huge demands which would be outright rejected at first. They wanted to start small and grow big. But of course, these simple demands were rejected, and so the boycott remained all the way through to the end of 1955 and then throughout 1956. A one-day boycott turned into an over a year-long event. The city eventually started to penalise black taxi drivers for aiding the boycotters, and so the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, organised a carpool instead. Every hurdle thrown in their way, they would just swiftly move past them. In early 1956, the homes of Martin Luther King and Edgar Nixon were both bombed, but they remained strong. In February 1956, city officials obtained injunctions against the boycott and indicted over 8 boycott leaders under a law from 1921 that prohibited conspiracies that interfered with lawful business. It was quite clear that the bus company just couldn't survive without their black customers, and the city were panicking. Martin Luther King was tried and convicted under this and was ordered to pay $500 or serve 386 days in jail, which is oddly specific. The boycott soon got national media attention and money was raised to help by people all over the country. On the 5th of June 1956, the Federal District Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional, and in November 1956 this was affirmed by the US Supreme Court. This was part of a suit called Browder versus Gale. 5 female plaintiffs, including Claudette Colvin, were fighting segregation on buses completely separate from the boycott. This case was actually filed by Fred Gray, the civil rights attorney who had originally represented Claudette, and was filed just 2 months after Rosa Parks had been arrested. The main plaintiffs were Claudette, Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, and Mary Smith. Jeanette Reeves was also originally a plaintiff, but she was intimidated off the case. But you still don't hear or learn the name Claudette Colvin, nor any of these other women, and they fought it all the way up to the top. And whilst everyone else gave up on Claudette and her fight, Fred Gray never did. He took it all the way. The MIA resolved not to end the boycott until the day Montgomery actually desegregated the buses. It was one thing the Supreme Court ruling that they should do, another thing the city actually doing it. On December 20th, 1956, Martin Luther King called for the boycott to finally come to an end, and the next day him and a number of other leaders boarded a desegregated bus for the very first time. Rosa Parks also boarded a bus and sat near the front. She actually ended up having to move out of the state the very next year as she lost her job as a seamstress due to everything that happened, and her husband also lost his job. They ended up in Detroit, Michigan, where things were thought to be better, but they weren't. There was still a lot of work for Rosa Parks to do, and she had spent many years travelling and speaking about the issues faced by the black community. Claudette Colvin also ended up having to move out of the state due to similar issues. She was branded a troublemaker and she was never going to fit in, and so she headed to New York, where she spent the next 35 years working as a nurse's assistant in a nursing home. Claudette's still alive today. She's 81 years old and still speaking out against injustice. Her name and her face were left out of the history books, but there's still time to fix that. She says she's disappointed that she didn't get more recognition, and her family are actively fighting to get her name heard. If not for Claudette and multiple other people, we might not know the names Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King Jr. Does that diminish the incredible things the latter did? Not at all, but there's space in the history books for the full story. In Montgomery, there's a street named after Claudette, and in 2017 it was announced by the mayor of the city that March 2nd every year is Claudette Colvin Day. But I think we can do more. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.